Tonight we're very happy to honor two United States Senators with the Paul E. Tsongas Economic Patriot Award, which recognizes leadership in and commitment to Concord's twin goals of fiscal and generational responsibility. Our first awardee of the evening is for Senator Tom Coburn. Senator Coburn of Oklahoma has earned a well-deserved reputation as one of that body's hardest workers and a leader in the fight for sustainable fiscal policy. Senator Coburn has been front and center in the highest profile efforts to solve America's long-term deficits and debt problems. He was a member of the Simpson-Bowles Commission and afterwards in the Senate Gang of Six. His devotion to reducing unnecessary spending is one of his trademarks. I think that's the thing we will remember him most for in his Senate career, as being the one who was, in the House and Senate, as being the one who was able to go after wasteful spending. That commitment hasn't always won him friends among his colleagues, but it reveals his passion for a sustainable fiscal solution, and one that will benefit Americans today and those for coming generations who will bear the burden of our debts if we fail to correct our course. Senator Coburn as Senator Coburn put it himself in announcing support for the Bowles-Simpson recommendation, it's not the report that he would have written, but it represented our best hope to date for a bipartisan agreement. And that sentiment of saying you can't get everything you want, but at some point you need to compromise for the best you can get in the national interest, is the sort of sentiment that the Concord Coalition has long honored and motivates our giving him the award. Senator Coburn is not able to be with us tonight, but he wanted me to convey his sincere appreciation to the supporters of the Concord Coalition and to those of you who share his commitment to serious and sustainable fiscal reforms. We're fortunate to have accepting the award on his behalf tonight Senator Judd Gregg, former chairman of the Budget Committee, a past honoree and member of the Concord Coalition Board of Directors. Senator Gregg.
You want me to say something? Thank you, Bob. It's a great privilege and honor to be here on behalf of Senator Coburn. It's equally a privilege to be here with the Majority Whip, Senator Durbin, who, in my opinion, is a profile in courage. His vote on Simpson-Bowles gave it legitimacy, along with the votes of Senator Coburn and Senator Crapo, because it showed that people of very different ideological views could come together on a very complex issue, which is solving the debt, and address it in a constructive way. And without Senator Durbin's support, it would have been much more difficult to make the Simpson-Bowles Commission viable. So it's a pleasure to be here with Senator Durbin. On behalf of Senator Coburn, let me just simply say my own personal observation of Tom Coburn. For as long as he has been in the Congress, he's been the conscience of the Congress on fiscal issues, on spending. He's made many of us feel uncomfortable over the years by being the conscience and coming up to us on the floor and saying, how can you vote for that? And done it most effectively because he's not strident. He's willing to go across the aisle, discuss the issues, and his purpose is to govern and to reach agreement in a way that moves us forward towards fiscal responsibility. I think he represents the absolute epitome of what a member of the Senate should be if they are interested in getting our fiscal house in order. So it's a great honor to represent Senator Coburn here tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
And our second honoree is Senator Richard Durbin. As a young man, he's still a young man. Some time ago, Senator Durbin had the great fortune to have two giants of Illinois politics as his mentors, Senators Paul Douglas and Senator Paul Simon. Senator Paul Simon actually had something to do with the original founding of the Concord Coalition. I was being reminded from Kitty Kurth that he was in on one of the original dinners discussing the future of the Concord Coalition. So it's very fitting then to present Senator Durbin with an award named for the Concord Coalition's founding co-chair, Paul Tsongas. A lot of Pauls. Paul Simon, Paul Tsongas. Senator Durbin earned this distinction tonight because, like his co-honoree, he's willing to make the hard choices and bear the brunt of criticism, even from within his own party, as he's reached across the aisle to work out bipartisan and practical solutions that will put our nation on a sounder fiscal footing. Like Senator Gregg mentioned, as a member of the Bowles-Simpson Commission and the Gang of Six, he struggled very hard and admirably. Even more commendably, Senator Durbin has taken this bold stance as a member of Senate leadership, and it's always more difficult for leadership to take positions on a bipartisan basis, and Senator Durbin, I think, is particularly to be commended for doing that. As Majority Whip, he has to negotiate a path that tries to appeal to all segments of his party while not at the expense of his own principles. Many politicians, some of whom are now former politicians, have felt the consequences of even daring to discuss issues like Social Security and Medicare or tax reform. Senator Durbin has used his unique status as a Democratic leader and progressive in the mold of Senators Douglas and Simpson to argue that policies that will make Medicare and Social Security sustainable are good both for fiscal responsibility and retirement security. So we admire the courage and conviction of Senator Durbin, and it's with great pleasure that I present our 2014 Paul E. Tsongas Economic Patriot Award to Senator Durbin.
Bob, thanks a lot. It's great to be here this evening with my former colleagues, John Tanner of Tennessee. He and I went to China one time and discovered more Tennessee volunteers than I ever could imagine would be found in that country. Mike Castle, former governor, former congressman, great leader in the House of Representatives and in Congress. Good to see you here. And of course, Evan Bayh, my neighbor from Indiana, who I was honored to serve with for a number of years, and wishing you the best. I hear the twins are now headed to college. Maybe that means you're headed back to public service, which would be a good thing. So I hope you're thinking about that. I know Susan said, you're coming home. We're going to raise these kids, and then we'll talk. But I wish you the best if you make that decision. And before I say a word about another former senator who's already been up here, I was just thinking about a story involving Michael Jordan. You would expect that, wouldn't you? Representing the city of Chicago and being from Illinois. The year was 1990, and the Chicago Bulls were playing the Cleveland Cavaliers in a playoff game, and Michael Jordan scored 69 points in one game. And after the game, they went up to Stacey King, who was a center for the Bulls, and they said, what was it like to be out there when Michael Jordan was scoring 69 points? He said, as long as I live, I will never forget the night that Michael Jordan and I scored 70 points. That's what I thought as Judd Gregg spoke, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. It is great to give praise around, and he does it, and very graciously. But there would never have been a Simpson Bowles Commission were it not for Judd Gregg and Kent Conrad. The two of them, and we were on the same trip to South America, wasn't it? And they sat together on the plane like they were high school students who had just met for the first time, and they were the best of buddies, and they wouldn't talk to anybody else except one another. And it went all the way down to South America and all the way back, and they were hatching this idea of creating a budget deficit commission, which ultimately became the Simpson Bowles Commission. So I feel like Stacey King in the presence of Michael Jordan when I think about Judd Gregg and his sidekick, Kent Conrad, who on a bipartisan basis got the United States of America and its Congress to focus in a positive way about the budget deficit. Give Judd Gregg a round of applause. He deserves it. I'm going to tell you two quick stories that I think kind of tell the story about who I am, what I think about this issue. Paul Tsongas and Paul Simon came to the Congress the same year, Watergate babies. They were both liberals, but they believed what another senator once said. I worked as a college kid for a senator from Illinois named Paul Douglas. And Paul Douglas used to say, you don't have to be wasteful to be liberal. And Douglas believed that, Simon believed that, and I believe that. I think Paul Tsongas believed that too. And that is what inspired them, Tsongas and Simon and others, from the progressive side to get in the conversation. And it's important that we do, because there are things that I value, including entitlement programs, which I worry about. And younger people in this audience should worry about it as well. We only have a limited time to fix some of these programs, or we're going to reach a crisis, a catastrophe. I think about our situation in Illinois, where at a state basis, and even with the city of Chicago, our pension systems are so bankrupt that we are faced with choices that are horrible, choices that affect current retirees and those about to retire, things which you could never, ever explain or justify. We are forced to face because 10 years ago, no one faced it, and 20 years before, no one faced it. And that, I think, is what we have to look at from the progressive side when it comes to these important, critical entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare in particular, not to mention Medicaid and the others that are associated with it. Putting this off does not make it easier. It makes it dramatically harder. But like April 15th and your dentist appointment, you wait to the last minute. And I'm afraid politically that's what we're inclined to do, and it would be a mistake. The second thing that troubles me is as these entitlement programs grow exponentially, it starves out so many other things. Let me give you one example, an example which I took up a few months ago and introduced a bill called the American Cures Act. I went out to the National Institutes of Health, the preeminent medical research agency in the world, and I sat across the table from Francis Collins, a medical doctor who is nothing short of a miracle man. He was given the task of mapping the human genome, and he did it on time. And in doing it, he unleashed investment in medical research at a level no one could imagine. All this new information and all the ways to use it. And I said to Francis Collins, tell me what the National Institutes of Health needs for its future. He said, well, I'll tell you a few things to reflect on. Because we have been unable or unwilling politically to fund the National Institutes of Health to cover inflation, over the last 10 years, NIH has lost its capacity to award medical research grants by 22%. Compared to 10 years ago, 22% fewer medical research grants because we don't fund it adequately. And that goes for both presidents of both political parties, I might add. Secondly, he said there's something more troubling. What's more troubling is the notion of taking a survey of who does medical research at the NIH. Well, he said we took a survey. 30 years ago, when we looked at these medical researchers, PhDs and MDs, we found that 19% of the medical researchers were under the age of 36, 30 years ago. 19% under the age of 36. Today, 3%. They've lost hope. They don't believe we're committed to this anymore, and they're not prepared to commit their lives to it. Now, what impact does that have? Well, unfortunately, for everybody in this room, it's a gamble we're all taking. A gamble for ourselves and for people we love, that when the day comes that you get the diagnosis that gives you the big gulp on, oh my God, moment, and you say to the doctor, is there any prescription or pharmaceutical? Is there any medical device? Is there any surgical technique? You want that answer to be yes, they just discovered it. Now, I believe in that. I believe in it because as a kid, now this does identify how old I am, I grew up in the shadow of iron lungs. Polio was an epidemic disease in America, and we didn't know where the hell it came from. My mother thought it came from rainwater standing in the streets, and it was as good a theory as anybody had. And then I remember, as a grade school kid, a doctor named Jonas Salk, who came up with a polio vaccine, and even though it meant getting stuck with a needle, it meant that I wasn't going to end up crippled in an iron lung. It changed the world. We're now 2 countries away from eliminating polio around the world. Medical research does those things, and we are not investing in it because we are being dragged into a situation with entitlements and other spending that makes it impossible. The last point I want to make is this. I introduced this American Cures Act after Francis Collins said, if you could just give 5% a year real growth for 10 years at NIH, CDC, the VA, and the Department of Defense, I'll restore this march toward progress that America once led in. 5% a year. What does that cost over 10 years? $140 billion. $140 billion. How much will we be spending in our federal budget over the next 10 years? 18 trillion? I don't know, somewhere in that range. What does $140 billion look next to that? Give me another perspective. Every 68 seconds in America, someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Every 68 seconds. Last year, Medicare, Medicaid, we spent over $200 billion just on Alzheimer's. If NIH could delay the onset of Alzheimer's 4 months, we could pay for all the research I just described to you. If they found a cure, God willing, it would just change so many lives. Now add to that diabetes and so many other things. So this conversation about deficits is not just the green eye shade, assets and liabilities, expenditures and revenues. It really gets down to the heart of what we're going to be as a people and what we're going to provide as a government. I don't want to assess the scene on Capitol Hill today. It's pretty depressing. There's not much positive conversation. I'll close with this. Somebody said, I think it was Mark Warner. We drank a glass of wine. You may find it hard to believe Mark Warner drinks wine. But we drank a glass of wine the other night and said, will we ever get back in this conversation? The Simpson Bowles conversation, the gang is sick conversation? There's a chance. And the chance may be next year. And the chance may be when the Murray-Ryan deal comes to an end and we need a new deal. And maybe, just maybe, at that moment, there'll be a conversation that goes beyond what the budgets will look like for the next year or two and gets into some deeper questions. I personally believe this president is ready, that he's prepared, if we're going to put the tax code on the table, to put entitlements on the table and have that honest conversation. I just hope there's a willingness on the other side as well in the spirit of Paul Tsongas. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Durbin, and I will tell you this is an appropriate time to say that we will have dessert now that we've done our duty here, and I'd also invite the panel to come up. And returning for her second year as our moderator for this panel, since we solved all the problems last year, Laurie Montgomery of the Washington Post.
Yeah, so last year when I was here, I was rushing over here from negotiations over at the Capitol. We had just shut down the government. We were talking about what we were going to do about the debt limit. And it all felt very hopeless. And I said that I thought things had reached a nadir. And all the issues that everyone in the room cares about so much, just it really looked like nothing was going to get solved. And I was right, except for the nadir part. Because now nobody's even talking about this stuff. So I was at a thing earlier this evening, and I said, well, what do you think we should talk about? And one person said, who doesn't cover budget issues, works for a large news service that I won't name, that is owned by a former mayor of New York. He said, well, why don't you point out that the deficit's been cut in half in whatever period of time, and why do we care about this problem at all? I said, yeah, I don't think that's really going to go over very well in that room. So then I went up to another friend of mine who covers economic issues for another large organization that I won't name, but is a newspaper based in New York. I said, so Neil, if his name were Neil, what do you think we should talk about? And he said, grand bargain, ha, 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 and laughed at me. So I guess we can pick up where Senator Durbin so capably left us in his remarks, which is, what is it going to take to restart the conversation that we are no longer having? What's the next trigger, do you think? And Senator Gregg, since you have been a trigger man in the past, why don't we start with you?
Well, that's a tough charge, but I think Senator Durbin has a better sense of it probably than any of us here because he's in the middle of it, and his assessment that when the Murray-Ryan language ends, that will create a crisis which forces action is probably pretty reasonable. I think who controls the Senate is also going to be a major factor. My view is that the Senate will go Republican in the next election. That if both the House and Senate are Republican, then the Republicans control half the government. And at that point, they can no longer afford not to govern. Today, they can afford not to govern because they don't have the government. But once you control half the government, the people expect you to govern. That's what they sent you here for. And so there's going to have to be some attempt made to reach accommodation on major issues where there is a chance for accommodation. And the most obvious that deals with the budget is tax reform. But you probably can't get tax reform unless you get some sort of entitlement action. So I do think that next spring there is a reasonable opportunity, should the House and the Senate both be Republican, that you'll end up with two forcing mechanisms. One, Murray-Ryan coming to an end, and two, the fact that Republicans will say they will recognize they have to govern, and the president will be in the last 2 years of his presidency, and he'll want some sort of substantive legacy, I presume, on getting this issue resolved, or at least moved in the right direction. So I'm reasonably optimistic that the opportunities are there, even though there's not much discussion of it now, and there won't be right through the election, because nobody wants to take on these tough issues going up to the election.
Senator Bayh, you want to weigh in on the likelihood of revisiting these issues?
Well, I too am an optimist, Lori, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it, frankly. And I admire my good friend and colleague Judd's rosier scenario. And it is, if you're a betting person, you'd say it would take an exogenous event. And possibly it's the expiration of Murray-Ryan, although my guess is that it would probably ultimately lead to a continuation of more or less the status quo. You could have, at some point, a spike in inflation. That doesn't seem likely right now. You could have a run on the dollar. That doesn't seem likely right now. But it's going to take some sort of exogenous event or something on automatic pilot, like Senator Gregg was suggesting, I think, to ultimately reach a resolution. Why is that? We have a long-term fiscal challenge in this country. It is unsustainable, as all the speakers have mentioned tonight. But really, that is also a political challenge. If you look at the two parties, whether the Eric Cantor race a week ago, members of the House looking at that, are they really going to vote to raise revenue if you're a Republican? Conversely, if Judd is correct, and I think he may very well be, that the Republicans are back in the majority in the Senate, it's going to be 51-49 or something very close. Are the Democrats in the Senate, who, if you look at the next cycle immediately thereafter, have a chance of getting back in, are they really going to energize their base by cutting entitlements? And with all due respect to the president, who will be in his final 2 years, how much political capital will he have to bring to the table when the politicians on both sides are looking at their own self-preservation? So is it possible? Yes, it's possible, but I think it's difficult. And the thought I'd like to leave all of you with, and I'm delighted to see so many young people here today because it really is your future we're talking about. Those of us who are a bit more senior here tonight inherited a pretty good balance sheet in this country, and we proceeded to leverage it up. And you can only do that once. And it's an unfortunate legacy we may pass on to you if nothing is done. But the point I want to leave you with is we have a fiscal challenge, which is really a political challenge, which really is a societal challenge. If you look at the Pew poll from a week or two ago, the two parties are more polarized than ever before. The Democratic Party has moved further left. The Republican Party has moved even further right. And in addition to that, the bases of the two parties view each other with a deep level of suspicion, almost to the point at which any sort of compromise or working with the other party is viewed as an act of betrayal rather than an act of compromise. Historically, principled compromise was viewed as an act of statesmanship. For the bases of the two parties today, it's viewed as an act of betrayal, which is actually harmful to the country. Why is that? I was talking here at dinner about the passing of the greatest generation. Those who came through the Great Depression, the Second World War, the struggle against global communism, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, understood that there were greater threats to the welfare of the Republic than members of the other political party. Some of that is dissipated now. And so we've got to find The truth of the matter, and I'm going to be quiet here, Lori, but one of my favorite quotes is from a civil rights leader who once said, "We may have arrived on these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." Not enough Americans are looking at it that way. We have a common destiny. We are in this together, but too many Americans aren't looking at it that way. And those who do don't tend to vote in primaries, don't tend to make political contributions, and don't tend to volunteer in campaigns. So people who care about issues like this, principled compromise, the sensible center, have to get involved in politics once again and take the process back from the extremes. I think that's finally when we'll get an answer to this, but that may take a while.
I wonder, Congressman Castle, so it raises an interesting question, what does happen if Republicans take the Senate? And I wonder if, it could be a trigger for action, but I wonder if there can even be agreement between the Senate and the House. You are intimately familiar with some intra-party pressures that might present themselves. I mean, I kind of wonder if they can even pass a budget if Republicans take the Senate.
Well, that's probably all very accurate. The first two speakers described themselves as optimists, and they gave two of them more pessimistic little talks I've heard in a long time. That's sort of like the Congress of the United States today. It's they talk a good game, but not much comes from it. There are tremendous differences within the parties. And it's perhaps a little more obvious in the Republican Party because of the impact of the Tea Party and people like me who was a victim of that, but people like others who've been a victim of it as well, or even those like the election last night of Thad Cochran, who won narrowly, but had a good scare in the whole thing. I mean, it's just become very, very difficult. The Congress of the United States today is a difficult place. You've got in the Republican Party, there's always somebody to the other side of you. I mean, people like Eric Cantor losing because he wasn't perhaps conservative enough as one of the elements in his defeat is amazing to me. You just see it on a regular basis. There's always somebody coming for you, but there are problems on the Democratic side too. There are extraordinarily perhaps called progressive or very liberal members who probably think that Evan is far more conservative than he should be. He's actually, in my judgment, very balanced.
No doubt about that, Mike.
And it makes it very difficult. And the reasons for this aren't just the politicians either. It is, to some degree, the news media, the fact it's as you know, very divided, that the cable news media in particular has chosen to be either very conservative or very liberal. It makes it very difficult for individuals trying to pick their way through the paths which are littered with bombs and make the right decisions and not be criticized by somebody perhaps even in their own party. It is very simple now with the use of instant communications and computers. You vote for a piece of legislation and immediately somebody's attacking you. If you're a Republican, the Democratic Party's attacking you and vice versa for your vote. Perhaps it costs too much money, or for some reason or another you're hurting children or women or doing something that offends people in some way or another, and they come after you immediately, and it just makes it very hard for people to work together. Most members of Congress now are reluctant to sign on to legislation with other members of Congress. In the old days, we all worked together, and in the old days, it wasn't that long ago, we worked together in terms of getting legislation done. It was the way to do business. So if Republicans were to take over the Senate, and that is a distinct possibility. I mean, it may happen regardless of what your politics may be. And if it happens, it is going to be very narrow. It's going to be very difficult just getting anything done in the Senate, much less getting something done between the Senate and the House. You're going to have a very strong Tea Party influence in the House, and you're going to have some of that influence in the Senate, which is going to make it hard for Republicans to get done. But I agree with Judd. I think if Republicans win the Senate, they darn well better be thinking about what the heck is our agenda. We cannot just sit there and say, no, it's all Obama's fault or whatever it may be. Now, all of a sudden you had to produce, or you're going to have one heck of a difficult election, which is going to be a presidential election 2 years after that. So they're going to really have to put their minds together and try to get something done. And frankly, to get it done, in my opinion, they're going to have to work with both parties to get it done. I don't see either party at this point, because these are roughly divided, the House and the Senate, being able to do anything without some element of the other party. And many of the Tea Party members in the House will say, we want a majority of the majority to get things done, meaning just Republicans in their case. And frankly, I don't think that's the answer either. So I think it's going to be very difficult. I just think the next 2 years are going to be tough. I don't see the president having much sway at all during those 2 years. And I think that it's unlikely that Republicans will have too much going for them. I will say in the House that it may be better in some ways. I think that Kevin McCarthy might be a good majority leader. I think John Boehner's always been a pretty good speaker. I think there's always a concern that Eric Cantor was a very good person, a good politician, but there was always a thought that he's running for speaker. I think it made John Boehner a little bit, and his staff a little bit apprehensive about what they did. And I think perhaps that will go away, so the House might function a little bit better. But I don't see the next few years as being easy. And the issues we're talking about here tonight, and we care about, really are going to take some pulling together. And it's going to take both parties and the White House pulling together in order to begin to solve some of the economic and fiscal issues that face this country. And at this point, at least from my vantage point, I just don't see it happening.
That's the optimistic view, right?
Yeah. I said I was going to be
just
pessimistic.
add one thing, I hope Judd Gregg is right, and let's see, and keep our fingers crossed. But I suspect there may be an opportunity, but it's going to be in 2 years. Don't underestimate executive leadership. That's the point I wanted to make, Lori. So we're going to have a new president coming in, and usually there's a window there for 6 to 9 months where people are willing to give the new executive, if that person makes tax reform, long-term fiscal stability, and growth, economic growth, sort of where those concentric circles overlap, the sweet spot, and says, I need you on this, I'm asking for your vote on this, I'm asking you to sacrifice for this. Usually that's your chance of getting it done. The members of the president's party will say, look, I'm going to give that person the benefit of the doubt on this. They're new, let's see what they can do. The other party, when it comes to tough decisions like this, might very well say, there are no easy answers here. There's nothing but hard votes, so let's let them take the blame for it and kind of provide enough votes to go along. So I do think there's going to be a win. I have a hard time seeing it before the next presidential election, but I do think there's an opportunity there. But it's going to take some profiles and courage, and but after all, that's why they pay the big money.
Well, I don't want to step on John's thoughts because I'd like to get his, but in order for your scenario to work, Evan, between now and 2 years from now, organizations like the Concord Coalition, Fix the Debt, Committee for a Responsible Budget have to lay the groundwork.
That's right.
That's why this organization is so important, because you can't allow the message to disappear for the next 2 years. It has to be continually, there has to be a drumbeat. Even if it's not being listened to, there has to be a drumbeat that reflects the importance of the issue so that 2 years from now it will be high on the agenda.
Well, the prospect of, the next president, the next administration being the great white hope for a grand bargain is interesting because when this president took over, if I'm not mistaken, Congressman Tanner was the head of an organization in the House that was very interested in having the new administration tackle these issues. And what happened there?
What is the Congress approval rate now? 9%? Oh, okay. Well, it reminds me of the guy that called the radio show and said, I think the Washington Redskins ought to change their name. And the fellow said, oh, really? What do you think they ought to say? He said, can't they come up with something better than Washington? I have my own views on the problems, and it involves gerrymandering. That has divided the Congress into a situation where the members are trapped in an awful system where the political, sane, sensible middle that our division of powers so brilliantly written into the Constitution demands is no longer possible by the practitioners. That's my own view. But I think I agree with most of the things that have been said. What I am more concerned about than anything is the lack of urgency by not only the public but by the politicians and the office holders on this issue. As the great economist Herbert Klein once said, what cannot go on forever won't. We cannot keep going down this fiscal path of borrowing the amount of money we're borrowing to finance our consumption in this country forever. And one day, I don't know when it is, in the future, it's going to remind me of the story, I'll tell one more story, where this turtle attacked a snail. And the police went out to interview the snail about this attack and said, what happened when the turtle attacked you? And the snail said, I can't remember, it all happened so quickly. At some point, when all of a sudden interest rates go to double digit, inflation goes to double digit, and when we open the window to borrow money, nobody comes by unless the interest rates go up 2, 3, 4% to buy our debt, then it's going to all say, what happened? It happened so quickly. And so that's why I think our work here tonight is so important, as Judd or Evan or Mike or someone said, to lay the groundwork so that we don't face that eventuality.
Well, so let's say you were in Mitch McConnell's shoes, since you, Senator Gregg, think that the Republican takeover of the Senate is the next likely hope for some activity. What's your agenda? How do you attack this? You really want to be the party that goes after entitlements?
Well, first off, big issues. Entitlements, specifically Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and tax reform, cannot be managed in a partisan way. If there's one lesson that should have been learned by legislators as a result of Obamacare ACA, it is that you cannot pass a partisan piece of legislation and have it be accepted without massive disruption within the political arena. And so right up front, the next leaders, including, and I think certainly the Speaker gets this, and I'm sure Mitch McConnell will get it should he become the majority leader, and if the President wants to engage, they're going to understand that that they're going to have to leave some of their membership behind in order to do what has to be done. But the critical element is that if they do not govern while they have the reins of government, then the American people are going to exact significant penalty on them. And as Evan points out, the next cycle is not a good cycle for Republican members of the Senate. So you've got to have shown that you are willing to govern. And you're going to have to go across the aisle to do that. And the irony, and not the irony, but the fact is that within the Senate there is a working middle if it would be energized by a belief that it could actually accomplish something. And that depends on presidential leadership, but it also depends on the leadership of the Senate saying, okay, sit down and try to work something out. The Gang of Six was not a Gang of Six. It was a gang of 30 or 40, maybe even 50, when they really had momentum. And so the opportunity's there. It's just a question of leadership. It all comes down to leadership.
So do you think the working middle in the Senate would emerge more fully under a Majority Leader McConnell than it has under a Majority Leader Reid? Senator Bayh?
Well, Lori, I'm sorry to see our time.
Typical Washington Post question.
Look, I think either leader is going to have a challenge. I mean, certainly getting to 60 votes on anything. You know, some budget issues you can pass under reconciliation with only 50, 51. So that's a little bit different. But there are enough members in the Republican caucus now. I think it would be hard for Mitch to deal with them without getting a few Democratic votes. And the way the Republicans, ironically, are going to get to 51 is probably by beating a bunch of the more moderate Democrats, which means that the Democratic caucus will skew further to the left, which won't make it any easier. And I think that's why it gets back to executive leadership more likely under the next president than the last 2 years of the current president, just because you've spent your capital and you're ratings are low and people are looking over the horizon to what's coming next. But I will say, and Judd, I thought you were very appropriately, very just in your comments about Dick Durbin. Dick said something important here tonight. I was surprised when he voted for the commission report. Pleasantly surprised, because I know Dick's a pretty liberal guy. In our caucus, you could always count on him to take a pretty progressive point of view. But what he said, and it's different than it was 10 years ago when I would go into those meetings, what you heard him say here tonight was there's a growing recognition on the part of more progressive Democrats that if nothing is done about entitlements, there will be nothing left for anything else they care about. Education, healthcare, the environment, medical research, kind of go down the list. And they care passionately about those things. So that reality, the crowding out of support for anything else, is forcing the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party to come to grips on this. Now, if many of them would have their way, it would be almost all tax increases, but that's just not going to happen. And so they're going to be willing to re-explore some aspects of entitlement reform and possibly some aspects of tax reform that will have the consequence of reducing expenditures and maybe generating some additional revenues based upon higher rates of economic growth than would otherwise be the case. So I thought that was you can see a very positive development going on within the Democratic Party that may help my group eventually get there in the Senate. But it will be harder because there may be fewer moderates.
I'm wondering, Congressman Tanner.
And forgive me, Lori, one final thing. What is going on inside the Republican Party today, you will see in mirror image within the Democratic Party, but the fact that we have a president of our party has kind of kept a lid on things. But, these sorts of, look at the Pew poll. You can see it. And once there's no longer a Democratic president, you'll see the same kind of primary challenges taking place in the Democratic Party. Blanche Lincoln had one a few years ago. There were a couple of moderate Democrats from Pennsylvania who were defeated who didn't vote for the Affordable Care Act. And there's little straws in the wind, but it's going to come, which will make reaching that principled compromise harder.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask Congressman Tanner. I mean, I was kind of stunned, actually, when Senator Durbin voted for Bowles-Simpson and stood up and said that he thought that raising the retirement age for Social Security was a reasonable thing. I thought, wow, this is a big step forward. But in the end, I don't know that I actually see the broad movement that Senator Durbin is talking about among Democrats to engage on entitlements. Do you?
I was a co-founder of the Blue Dogs, and the Blue Dogs got their name because they were yellow dogs that were strangled from the far left and the far right till they turned blue. We were to the right of some of the Democrats on money and finances, and to the left of some of the Republicans on social issues. And that middle, by virtue of the gerrymandered House of Representatives, is gone. And these members are well-meaning, but they're trapped in a miserable system that has gerrymandered the country into red and blue districts such that the political kill zone is now the middle, that we all know as Americans, because the way our Constitution is written, requires sane, sensible, principled compromise to work. If you don't have that, what we've done is imposed a parliamentary model on a representative system by the gerrymander all across the country. And if you don't change that, you're asking members to jeopardize their careers by doing the right thing. And that's a hell of a system. That's a wrong system. They ought to be rewarded. And the only way you reward them is by doing away with this gerrymandering system and demanding that in every state they have independent commissions to draw the lines, so that members are rewarded by a broad appeal to sensible, sane, rational people who understand there has to be give and take in this system, not in the parliamentary world, but in our system, in order for us to govern ourselves. I don't want to get on the high horse about this, but damn it, what we've got's not working.
You know, you're absolutely right. When I give talks, when I'm teaching a little bit, I point to this issue as being the core systemic problem which we have as a system, which is the gerrymandering of the House. But you're not going to overcome that in the next 2 years, even with a new president. The way you overcome that is by having something come out of the Senate, which is where the middle meets and reaches a responsible agreement, which is built off of the ideas of the Concord Coalition or the Fix the Debt Coalition. And then it's taken to the House, and the president puts his political capital on the line, the speaker puts his political capital on the line. They step on some toes in their own parties, and you get the protection that the members of the House need in order to vote it. I think that's the only way to get it on a fast track, or a faster track, a speeded up snail track.
And you see that as an actual possibility in the next...
Well, I'd like to think I'm the optimist, obviously, in this group, and I'm a pretty pessimistic guy, so it's a hard role to play. But yeah, I see that as the most logical way to get to where we want to go. Evan may be right. Maybe it takes a structural outside event that creates a crisis, such as the TARP event, that gets cooperation across the aisles. Let's hope not.
Laurie, I think there are a couple of tripwires that are, if we need one, you know, one, and I'm one who thinks that the next real opportunity is probably the first budget of the next administration. Not that you want to give up on anything now. If the scenario plays out next spring where there might be some action, that would be great. I'm not betting on it, so I'm spending a lot of time, as is Concord, as is Fix the Debt, in Iowa and New Hampshire. Because I think that, to pick up on what Senator Gregg said, that it is important that the next president come into office with a mandate to put out a fiscal blueprint that would take care of some of these longer-term issues in their first budget. And, you know, it's been a tradition that the first budget of an incoming president has been consequential. You can think back to the Reagan budget or the Clinton budget, you know, George W. Bush. And certainly President Obama. So we can look at that as certainly an opportunity, particularly, which makes it important for folks in Iowa, New Hampshire, and other early primary states to make this an important issue, and that's certainly something that this organization is focused on right now. We do have also the pending disability trust fund insolvency, and you know,
during the election.
Yeah, it could come up, you know, anytime between 2016, somewhere in there. And that is something that Congress is going to have to deal with. Some piece of legislation affecting Social Security is going to have to pass the Congress, because when we talk about, you know, Social Security reform, we tend to think about long-term things, and people say, well, the trust fund is sound for whatever. In the case of disability, checks wouldn't be going out because there would be no authority to write them. That is the sort of thing that gets constituents' attention pretty quickly. So I think and I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but that would be another opportunity that sort of fits into the mix as well.
Do you think, Congressman Castle, that would be, I mean, there are those in the Republican Party now, I sort of wonder if they would be worried about checks going out to disability, people on disability. I mean, would that sort of focus the mind among the more extreme?
Well, it probably would focus the mind if those things were to happen. But you know, just a couple of thoughts of things that we should be focused on. I've reached an age in my life where I actually look at the obituary page now and I recognize friends and that kind of thing. It's a little unnerving, as a matter of fact. And if you listen to Senator Durbin carefully tonight, he talked about something. He talked about one of the things that's the result of the fact that we have such tremendous costs going on in this country. I mean, Medicaid and Medicare in particular are just eating up a large part of the funding of this country at this point, and it's a great problem. And he talked about the basic healthcare research that's missing. And you know, it's when you see friends who become ill, perhaps pass away or whatever it may be, you think about that. For the young people here, there is real hope that when you get to be whatever, 70, 75, 80, whatever, that there may be cures for Alzheimer's. There have been already much greater improvements in terms of taking care of one's heart, cancer, and a few other serious health problems in this country today and now around the world. And the bottom line is that is being squeezed out. I remember when I was in Congress a number of years ago, Newt Gingrich, who's not exactly a big spender, proposed one year after he had cast some votes not increasing healthcare research. He was talked to by some people. The next thing you know, he proposed doubling the amount of money for healthcare research, and it happened. He was the Speaker of the House, and it actually happened. And that has been used since then to not give it the increases it probably should get. And he's right, the senator's right, in that healthcare research has just not had the increases which are necessary to do the medical discoveries that could make lives longer and better for many people around the world. And it's a shame. It's a tremendous loss. And we don't have the researchers now staying in place or people choosing to go into research. You'd rather go to Wall Street and make a lot of money or whatever it may be. These are all very bright people, so they probably can do that. And that's a tremendous problem. So there are real impacts going on because of the spending problems of this country now. Another one is obviously the whole business of transportation in this country. There are some significant transportation problems in the United States of America today that really do need to be addressed, and it's not there. And the will is not there in this Congress at this point to pass any kind of revenue-raising measure that would help with that. But there are bridges which have collapsed. There are other bridges that are in danger of that. There are highways which are crumbling. There are airport problems. There's a number of things happening in the United States of America. There's a litany of these things, and we're beginning to feel that impact. Everyone always says, well, at some point Medicare is going to hit the wall. That's going to be relatively soon, 5, 10 years, whatever it may be. And that's really going to get everybody's attention. But the truth of the matter is that young people in particular ought to be paying attention to this right now because there are serious deficiencies in the increases in some of these budgets and things not happening that should be happening in the United States of America. And don't get me going on the cost of education increases. That's a whole other world that we could get into that's abysmal as well. And for those of you who have been to college recently, take a look back at how much your college president, how much your football coach and your basketball coach are getting paid. You might be a little surprised at your choice of life if you're not in one of those professions.
What does strike me is that we do keep talking about these triggers as if they're going to make, except for the idea that a new president will come in and present a budget and solve the problem, which didn't happen the last time. We talk about these triggers that will force some kind of action, and the latest round of triggers was sort of set off by Bowles-Simpson, and I'm wondering if we keep hitting these triggers and yet nothing happens, and we find a way around them. And Bowles-Simpson came to be in part because you and Senator Conrad saw no action at the White House on these issues. Is that what's been missing?
Yes. Just look at this recent VA vote. They declared it an emergency. Here's a problem that's been going on for years, decades, and then they converted it to a mandatory program, and 97 people voted for it in the Senate. So the political will isn't there, and the political will usually comes out of crisis, as Evan so aptly observed, but it may also come from leadership. And those of us who've been around the track a few times on the political and seen political will actually work, it does absolutely require the president to be the leader, because the president is the leader of this nation, and people follow the president. And if the president is stepping on toes of his constituencies, then people on the other side of the aisle are more willing to step on toes of their constituencies. So your question is does it require presidential leadership? Absolutely it requires. You're not going to get any of this done without presidential leadership, and even with presidential leadership, it may require an outside-the-box forcing mechanism, such as a fiscal crisis driven by lack of confidence in the dollar, driven by lack of the world to believe that we're going to pay our debts in real dollars as versus inflated dollars.
And at this moment, would anyone like to handicap the likely 2016 race for interest in these issues?
Laura, your question was handicap the race in terms of who's going to win, or whether this will be a cutting-edge issue in the election. No, well, look, I think I agree.
Oh,
with
of course
what
it's going to
Judge
be,
Bob's-
because the Concord Coalition and Fix the Debt are going to be out there making this number one. Would you like to revise your answer?
Well, I hope you're right, Bob. I hope you're right. You know, I suspect that this will be an important issue, but it won't be one of the ones that jumps off the polls they all take in terms of what actually moves votes. That having been said, when you're elected, you're supposed to do the right thing, and you've got a window of opportunity to really try and lay a legacy. And so it's going to, as all of us evaluate these candidates, we should ask ourselves, we hope that they'll make, and I'm sure they'll speak to this some, but even if it may not be the top one or two issues that they're running ads on and giving the impassioned speeches to the party faithful and all that kind of thing, we should evaluate these candidates through a lens of, okay, if that person's in office, when the chips are down and they're faced with making a pretty tough choice about the long-term best interests of this country, does that person have the priorities and the character to do the right thing? Because they're going to be forced on this issue, in some ways, to make some decisions. And will they go small, or will they say, nope, this is a chance to really make a legacy, I'm going to go big? I'm hoping that that's what they'll decide, and I think those of us who support this effort need to try and make that as high a priority as we can. So I suspect, Lori, it's one of those things that will emerge after the election, but we need to look at these people and make our judgments beforehand, because that's a big part of why we're going to be electing them or not.
Well, maybe I should ask Bob this question. I mean, what are you sensing, you know, among voters about? I mean, the issue just seems to have died.
Yeah,
sadly.
it has here, which is why I'm there.
Is it dead there too?
No. What I've found in traveling to Iowa and New Hampshire quite a bit this winter, in between snowstorms and canceled flights and that sort of thing, is that there's a great deal of interest in it, a great deal of frustration that nothing's been done about it, and an expectation that this is something that candidates should talk about. So the funny thing is that, you know, here we are before the 2014 elections. So you're up in Manchester or Concord or in Des Moines or Iowa City and beginning to talk to people, community activists, business leaders, political leaders about this issue. And in not one case did anybody say, what are you doing here? Are you, you know, I mean, they just sort of take it as a matter of course that, you know, yes, this is we're in the 2016 cycle and it's the next one, and they're interested in issues. This is one thing about both states, and you know, maybe if you were to design a primary system, you wouldn't do it this way, but I will say this to Iowa and New Hampshire, the voters and everybody in the state takes it very seriously, and it makes it a great thing for an organization like ours to educate voters about it. And so there's a lot of receptivity to that sort of thing. We've already done one forum in New Hampshire that Senator Gregg participated in last week with Ed Rendell. We got you know, a very good turnout for a breakfast discussion. John Broderick and I at the University of New Hampshire Rudman Center have been doing forums and will be planning more. And Sarah Imhoff is here, our Iowa State Director, and you know, we've already been planning some things with the business groups out there, and we've got a healthcare forum already planned for February of 2015 with speakers lined up. Chase Hageman is our New England regional coordinator who's been all over New Hampshire. So I've actually been encouraged by getting out and talking to voters in both parties, in both states, that this is something that can be made an issue. And if the candidates go up there with the idea that, that they can duck this issue, I think they're mistaken. You know, we've been thinking about, you know, themes, and, you know, one thing to remind people of, I think, the presidential candidates, is that, you know, in effect, the debt is your running mate. It's going to be with you when you're elected, and you're going to have to do something with it. So before they, you know, it doesn't matter what, you know, your big issue might be something else, you know, but the debt is your running mate, because no matter what issue you're interested in, tax reform, environmental protection, education reform, defense, national security, you're going to have to come back to the budget where priorities are set, dollars are committed, and we have this problem, and it's going to have to be dealt with. So pick whoever you want to as your running mate, but the debt's going to be there too.
And you, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I would encourage us in our outreach, get the business community involved, get young people involved, but just remember, Bob, a lot of the folks you're meeting with don't vote in primaries, and I suspect on the Democratic side, if Hillary Clinton runs, that will tend to, we won't have the kind of robust debate about some of these things until the fall campaign. The big problem, I think, that the harder politics is on the Republican side. I don't remember which debate it was last time, but you'll remember the one where the moderator said, well, you know, will any of you here vote to raise revenue? And nobody's hand went up. I said, well, how about if it was 70% spending cuts and 30% revenue? Not a hand went up. Finally he said, well, how about it was 90-10 and not a hand went up? That's tough.
It was in Iowa. I remember that one.
I think that to do this right, groups like Coalition and Fix the Debt and Committee for a Responsible Budget, we have to come up with some ideas that are viable in a bipartisan way to address the overarching issues, which are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security to a lesser degree, quite honestly, because it's so solvable, and if we just had leadership, we'd get it solved, and tax reform. And if we, and make those ideas credible in the marketplace. And so that the next president or the next Congress doesn't immediately react to them as a result of the interest groups which want to pillory them taking the playing field, but says, no, it makes sense to go to a changed CPI, and it doesn't affect people negatively. So I think we have to pick issues in a reasonably narrow sense, or areas in a reasonably narrow sense, where we have fixes to the deficit issues which can be bipartisanly embraced and which have significant compounding events to them. And make those viable and credible within the marketplace of ideas in the discussion of the presidential election and in also the congressional election.
You know, I'd just like to make a point to it, if I may. Most of us here, excuse me, John, we're governors of our states, and it's interesting. The governors essentially in the states basically decided to pass balanced budget amendments a few decades ago. And I think maybe there's one exception, but I think 49 states now have balanced budget amendments. I don't know of a single governor or state legislator who voted for those things who was punished by that. They can look at their constituents and say, I'm sorry, we'd like to be able to help you with this, but we just can't afford it, or whatever it may be. Choices have to be made. That same message, in my judgment, should be carried over to Washington, D.C., where we just print money and we essentially spend as much as we want, increase the debt, and have those problems. Well, the states can't do that. Now, don't get me wrong, state budgets are far simpler to manage, and they have capital budgets and other things they can do to be helpful. But the bottom line is that almost every single state in the United States of America has faced this problem and has come to the conclusion that we have to live within a balanced budget circumstance. Why the heck can't we do that at the federal government level? It just makes sense. To me, it should be the absolute #1 issue in a presidential race. And I think it's the president who can make a difference in this. I think we need a president, regardless of what the party may be, who's going to be able to step forward after this next election and say this absolutely has to happen. Decisions are going to have to be made.
May I add, I think one of our charges between now and the next election is to somehow bring a sense of urgency that is not, in my view, presently out there in the broad population to this issue, without the market collapsing and interest rates going to double digits and inflation going to double digits and so forth, like I said earlier. How do we bring this sense of urgency to do something before we have a market collapse? I think that's our charge.
Well, I'm wondering if it's interesting, your point about the debt being the running mate of whoever is going to be the next occupant of the White House. I mean, to add a perhaps more hopeful note to this conversation, have we at least sort of moved past the days when you could just blow past the deficit? I mean, the days when you just spent and didn't worry about it and solved problems. I mean, there are parts of the Democratic Party that argue we should be spending now. Borrowing rates are very low. We need to get the economy moving. But it feels like what Bob said is right, that the next administration is not going to be able to spend money on any priority without dealing with the pay-fors. I mean, have we at least ended any chance of returning to the bad old days when pay-go was out the window?
That's an optimistic look at it, and we still have an unsustainable budget. But no, I think that yes, in one sense, although I'm not sure how committed everybody is to the pay-go philosophy on the Hill. You can read the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's blogs on that on pay-go. I think that, but I think that the days of people just not worrying about it are past. But it's just like pay-go. Even if we had strict adherence to pay-go, that doesn't solve the underlying problem that we already have. It just keeps the problem from getting worse.
Yeah, but your point was any initiative, any new idea
right. I mean, it's going to have
is
to be
constrained by
right.
this, solving this underlying problem. Right. Senator Gregg says.
The good news is that the Congress is, the federal government is unlikely to take affirmative steps that will exacerbate the problem. That's the good news. The bad news is we're on an unsustainable path, so the status quo it doesn't get you to a very good place. But I'll leave you with an optimistic observation and a pessimistic one, which was when Bill Clinton came in, they passed a budget which the first one made at least some steps in the right direction, but they passed it by a single vote. It's a woman named Marjorie Margolis Mizvinsky. And she ended up losing her election, just recently lost a primary, but they did pass the budget by a single vote. Her son ended up marrying Chelsea. So there's a
consolation prize.
There's a good news. That's the good news. The bad news is Chelsea was an only child. So if Hillary's the next president, what do they have to give away for that critical vote? Maybe. Oh, I guess there are grandchildren on the horizon. Oh, there you go. There's an optimistic note.
Well, I have another optimistic note, which is that we have a tradition here at the Concord Coalition of always ending our dinners by at least 9:30, and we're gonna make that mark now. So I want to say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for the panel, and thank you for Lori for ending on a note of optimism. I guess that's good. As we try to scare people into looking at this issue and explain the facts, but we should nevertheless be optimistic about it, because after all, we should. It's actually about building a better future. And those of us who care about the deficit really do need to be make sure that we're not always just preaching gloom and doom, but talking about some of the things that Mike was talking about, and that how we can build a better country for future generations. And on that note, thank you everybody for coming. We are adjourned.